You know what's funny? When I started this year, I didn't actually set out to fix my yarn stash. I wasn't trying to be more disciplined or minimalist or become some kind of enlightened knitter who never impulse buys a skein again. Shh. I still like yarn a lot. What I really wanted was for knitting to stop feeling noisy. Because at some point, my stash stopped feeling like a creative resource and started feeling like background stress. It wasn't dramatic, it was just always there. A low-grade hum of, I should deal with this every time I pulled out a bin or reached for a project bag. So instead of buying a new app or more bins, which, to be honest, is usually my first instinct, I decided to actually look at what was going on. That's what Untangle the Stash last year turned into. Not a makeover, not a detox, just a year of paying attention with an unexpected surprise that happened in episode 11. When I want your opinions, Oscar, I'll ask. Episode 1, Confessions of a Yarn Hoarder. If you watched the first episode, you know I didn't ease into it gently. I pretty much opened with, "Hi, I'm Nicole and my stash is a situation."
Chaos, spilling out, ransacked, and much to my dismay, seems to be self-multiplying. Where to begin?
Welcome to Untangling the Stash, where each month we are going to tackle a piece of the yarn hoarding puzzle. Up until then, I'd been telling myself that the chaos was temporary, or that I'd get to it later, or that it would somehow resolve itself once I finished the next project. But naming it, calling it what it was, changed my relationship to it immediately. And judging by the comments, a lot of you felt that same sense of relief. Not shame, relief. The, oh, thank God, it's not just me kind. Like this comment from Isabel. "Thank you, Nicole, for all your work putting together these episodes. I decided on 31st December to work from my stash as of 1st January. She means last year, 2025. I started to be honest with myself by entering all the yarn I have in Ravelry. And when I say all, it's truly all. I've opened old bags. How old? I found a receipt from November 2007 in one of them. I decided to be honest, so let's play the game. I've entered all the quantities in Ravelry. I then exported the Excel spreadsheet to get numbers. I will write down what I'm using. I will enjoy seeing the total number decreasing week after week. I'll keep you posted on my progress. Looking forward to your next episode. Happy knitting." Thank you, Isabel. That was exactly the reaction and response that I was hoping for from that episode number 1, which was really about confronting your stash. Next came episode 2, Purge Your Stash Without Regret. One thing that surprised me as the series went on was how much impact the smallest changes had. Not the big overhauls, not the color-coded spreadsheets, which are coming later. The little things that made knitting feel smoother and less annoying on a day-to-day basis. This was probably the best example of that. It's almost ridiculous how effective it is.
Second is how to deal with those yarn ends on your hand-wound or partly used balls and cakes of yarn. I saw this hack somewhere recently and just immediately thought it was brilliant. Get yourself some of these snappy hair clips. I got these relatively cheap at a drugstore. You could probably get them even cheaper at a dollar store. Unsnap the clippy clip to make a little mouth, and then just pop it over the end and snap it shut. Secure and no snagging. And for extra credit, you could take your ball band and snap that in there with it. Game changer, right? I'm a big fan of this hack.
That silly little hair clip solved a problem I've been mildly irritated by for years. And that's when I realized something important. This whole process didn't need to be heroic. It just needed to remove some friction. Every tiny annoyance you eliminate is one less reason to avoid knitting from your stash. Viewer Susan said, I was just talking about this today with a friend, that I am going to be de-stashing some yarn at a yarn swap in April. My goal is to donate yarn and not bring anything else home. I want to make room for new yarns that I'm purchasing. It's not that the yarn I'm going to be donating is bad or anything. It's just my taste and yarn have changed over the years. I have 10 years worth of stashed yarn, approximately 25 bins full. Time to let some of it go. We all feel you, Susan. Well, not all of us. I know some of you out there don't even have a stash. The rest of us are a little confused by that. And then episode 3, sorting yarn like this, game changer. As we moved into sorting and categorizing, the conversation shifted again. It stopped being about volume and started being about uncertainty. Mystery skeins, lost labels, yarn I knew I had bought for something, but could no longer remember what that something was. This clip looks dramatic, and yes, there's fire, but the real point wasn't the technique, it was the confidence it gave people.
And I like to hold my yarn or fabric in some tweezers. The longer, the better. So let's hold this to the flame and see what happens. See it shrinking away from the flame? It's really more melting than burning. That's already a good indication that this is a synthetic. Once it's cooled off, you can feel the burned area, and this one is definitely a hard bead. Polyester. This guy is my little mystery yarn. Burning like crazy. Whoa, smells like burnt hair. This guy is wool, and the ash just crushes into dust. Super fun, right?
Once you stop being confused by the yarn you already own, everything gets easier. You don't hesitate as much. You don't second guess every decision. You don't stop thinking of your stash as this unknowable mass of fiber and start seeing it as materials you actually understand. Oh, poor you, Oscar. Apparently my viewer Kelly felt seen. You are talking to me. When did you sneak into my craft room, and why didn't you straighten up while there? I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that it might incriminate me. Then we hit storage. $1,200 of it to be exact. I told you I had an issue about buying new bins. And I know a lot of people think this is the fun episode, and it is. I love a bin, I love a basket, I love a bag. Oscar, I told you to stop hacking my email. But here's the thing I learned the hard way. Storage doesn't fix behavior. Where does your yarn live? This question still makes me laugh because it cuts right to the truth.
Start with a big question. Where is your yarn actually living? Are we talking about a dedicated yarn vault? Or are you pulling skeins out from behind the slow cooker? There's no wrong answer, just some options that kind of sort of work better than others.
Once I stopped expecting storage to magically make me more organized, my choices got a lot saner. I stopped trying to hide yarn and started trying to access it. The goal wasn't necessarily prettier shelves. It was fewer moments of, oh, I forgot I owned this. And Grandma's Magic suggested, alternatively, you could use any of your scrap yarn and create cubes. I've done that. I made mine into cube shelving, so they were the size of cubes themselves. They can hold a bit, and it makes it easy to pull out, have a look, and then slide back in without making a mess. Besides, you can color code them. Whatever color you want to store, you can make baskets in a similar colored craft yarn. That is just a crazy cool idea, Grandma's Magic. Thanks so much for sharing that with everyone. And we also had this from Donna. I retired 13 years ago and moved from Ontario to New Brunswick. I discovered Craftsy and went back to knitting and sewing. I met my best friends at Fabricville and yarn festivals. I remember asking on Craftsy, what is this stash of which you speak, and how do I go about acquiring one? And now I laugh and laugh. Totally relatable. I gotta say, I honestly can't remember the last time I had no yarn stash. Maybe never? Then on to episode 5, the best tips to bust your yarn stash. The biggest shift happened when we stopped talking about managing yarn and started talking about using it. Not punishing ourselves with ugly projects, not forcing scraps into things that we didn't actually want, but choosing techniques that naturally burn through yardage. The magic knot was one of the most practical skills I picked up all year.
But here's a quick demo of how it's done. I'm too lazy to set up the hand cam, so we're going to do it with really big yarn. This is it. You take the two ends and layer them over each other. On this side, you're going to wrap this end all the way around the other strand and pull it into a very snug knot. Then do the exact same thing at the other end, wrap it all the way around and tie it into a very snug knot. Now, you're going to carefully draw these two knots together until they have butted right up, and then tug on that connection as firmly as you can without breaking the yarn. If you do break the yarn, it's okay. Just cut it all off and start over. You're only losing a few inches. Once you're convinced, and yeah, I know, you won't be the first time, but you'll get there, that it is absolutely secure, you can take your scissors and just...
Scrap yarn stopped feeling like a problem once it had a purpose. And then garter stitch, marling, mosaic, crochet, these weren't tricks. These were all permission. Permission to stop saving yarn for some imaginary project and actually let it do what it's meant to do. Here's a great tip from Petra. Here's a tip I learned in a Scrap Socks group on Ravelry 10 years ago. Dye a bunch of scraps together in the same dye bath. It doesn't matter what the original colors were, they'll all look somewhat cohesive due to having the same overtone and be closer in value. Then you can marl the patterns, or a personal favorite of mine is to switch the yarn balls at the sides in a slip stitch pattern and carry the extra yarns up the seam. Petra, 100% genius. I love this idea. And by the way, I have a very cool yarn dyeing video coming up. It's going to be super fun, and I'm really excited about getting that one made. Okay, and then we're about halfway through the year, and in episode 6, we talk about the truth about Advent and mini skeins. So this is the part that's harder to talk about, buying. Not in a shaming way, just honestly. It seems viewers found Oscar and my antics extra funny in this video. It might have been the martini drinking while wearing a mini skein necklace.
What?
This next clip resonated because it named something a lot of us feel but don't articulate.
With the psychology of the mini skein. I've got one of those brains that insists on understanding things. So I found myself wondering, why do we buy these tiny yarns in the first place? After a lot of thought, I've boiled it down to a few plausible reasons. They feel indulgent without the guilt. A mini skein is like a macaron. Gorgeous, tiny, slightly unnecessary, super delicious, and therefore irresistible.
Once I understood why certain yarns were irresistible to me, it became much easier to pause. Not stop, pause. I totally did, Oscar. Buying yarn isn't the problem. Buying yarn without intention, without a plan to enjoy it later, is where things can start to feel heavy. Viewer Denise had these thoughts. Yeah, bought a 24 skein mini Advent a few years ago from a seller whose dye aesthetic I enjoyed, saturated, rich, earthy jewel tones. Good thing I didn't start a project before opening all the packs. The first 12 skeins were exactly what I had hoped for, and then the rest was all neon. And the full-size bonus skein didn't blend with either of the two groups. I haven't purchased an Advent since. Another totally relatable experience. A mystery, anything, is always going to be a gamble. So then we'd had 6 months go by of examining and analyzing our stash. And then it was time to look at, how am I going to deal with all of my unwanted yarn? By the time we got to this selling yarn episode, I think a lot of us were already quietly asking the same question. Is this actually worth my time? Because on paper, selling yarn sounds reasonable. You spent money on it. You didn't use it. Why not recoup some of that cost? But the more I dug into it and the more I actually tried to do it, the clearer it became that selling yarn isn't just list it and forget it. It's photographing. It's answering messages. It's weighing skeins. It's figuring out shipping. It's wondering whether someone's going to ghost you after asking 6 very detailed questions about yardage.
All kinds of stories, intentions, and even guilt to our yarn. But I was going to make a shawl with this. What if I need it someday? It was on sale. But keeping yarn you don't love is like keeping clothes that don't fit. They clog your space, stresses you out, and can make it harder to use the yarn that you do love. Okay, so at least some of it needs to go, and maybe you spent hard-earned coin on that fiber. So you're thinking, why not sell it and recoup some of that cash? But here's the thing. Is your yarn worth selling? Time to find out. Let's start with the harsh truth. Not all yarn is created equal, especially in the resale market. Here's some ideas about when yarn is going to be worth the effort. It's unused and still has the ball band. You know the fiber content, weight, and yardage. It's indie dyed, luxury, or discontinued, i.e., someone might hunt for it. You have enough for a decent project, at least 100 grams.
For some yarn, it makes absolute sense. Rare stuff, sweater quantities, discontinued yarns that someone is actively hunting for. But for a lot of what we're holding on to, selling yarn turns into a part-time admin job that pays not great. And I think that episode gave a lot of people permission to admit something important. Sometimes the emotional return on donating is actually higher. Our viewer friend Kelly had this to say. Several years ago, we were moving, and I just had this moment of clarity about what I was willing to move and get rid of, and what was just taking up space in my world and my mind. I posted on Facebook what I wanted to give away, and it was gone in a couple of days. It was a tremendous relief. Not one drop of regret. I was amazed how this action cleared my brain space. I felt lighter, accomplished, like a champion who had the courage to take charge of my life. I know, I sound like I'm overhyping it, but I was genuinely surprised at how good it made me feel. I was just looking to get rid of stuff and managed to lighten a crafty burden I didn't even know I was carrying. Sidebar, I still kept quite a lot of yarn. I just got rid of what didn't spark joy and then found more joy in creativity and having less. So well said, Kelly. Absolutely. Amen. And next up in episode 8, there were 5 excellent reasons to catalog your yarn. If selling was the reality check, cataloging was the turning point. This was the episode where things really shifted from vibes to information. Because once your yarn exists somewhere outside of your head, it stops being this vague cloud of, I think I have something I can use for that. Yeah, sometimes I don't, Oscar.
Ooh, what a cute pattern. I've got the perfect yarn for this. I'm going to go find it right now.
What surprised me was how calming this was. Not motivating, not exciting. Calming. Seeing what I actually had, how much of it, what weights, what fibers, made the stash feel finite instead of endless. And I know cataloging sounds deeply unsexy, but it removed so much second guessing, especially when it came to buying.
Reason number 2, you can plan projects with what you actually have and not what you think you have. I cannot even count how many times I thought in my head that I knew I had yarn only to get home from the yarn store and discover that I didn't. My head lied. This happens more and more frequently now. If you know, you know.
I came up with 5 reasons to track your stash. Rebecca added 4 more in this comment. Reason number 6. By uploading your stash to Ravelry, you might just rescue some poor soul who is losing at Yarn Chicken and can't get any more because it's a discontinued yarn. I've been rescued twice by finding someone who listed the skein I was looking for in their will, sell, or trade category, and I am so thankful. Reason number 7, it makes it easy to calculate your project cost if you enter the price you paid for the yarn. If a lot of time passes between when you buy the yarn and when you use it, it's easy to forget how much you spent. This is a stat I like to record with my projects. Reason number 8, it counts your yardage for you and recalculates how much you have left if you record your yarn usage on your projects. That way you have a handy reference for how much is in that partial skein without needing to dig it out and weigh it. Reason number 9, you now have a handy link from the yarn listing in your stash to the yarn page on Ravelry, where you can easily click to get project inspiration from other people who have also used this yarn. This is so fantastic, Rebecca. Where were you when I was writing that script? Now, episode number 9 might be my favorite because it's where idealism went to die in a good way. Shop your stash first is great advice, unless it turns into moral pressure, because the goal was never don't buy yarn. The goal was to use the yarn you've already paid for and loved enough to bring home.
Use the filters. I have 344 entries in here, so I'm not just going to scroll through them and try and find what I'm looking for. I'm going to use the filters so I can pull out the closest thing to what I'm looking for this pattern and then narrow it down from there.
What clicked for me was treating stash yarn as the starting point, not the consolation prize. When I started choosing patterns for the yarn I already owned, instead of trying to force yarn into patterns it didn't want to be, everything got easier. And yes, sometimes that still meant going to the yarn store to make something work. And of course, we might get to the, in case of emergency, break the glass and go yarn shopping. Sometimes, despite your best intentions, you will need to buy yarn, and that is okay, even encouraged. Just make sure that if you're concerned about your stash getting out of control, make sure it's supporting your stash busting goals and not sabotaging them. If you need one skein to turn 4 into a finished object, excellent, that's a good deal. If you need one skein and it comes home with 5 friends, no. Back away and alert the stash police. That's not cheating, it's problem solving. For viewers like Noelle, it's all about being a work in progress. Great suggestions. I also catalog my yarn on Ravelry, and like you, I use the search features to find pattern matches for my yarn. I'm doing pretty well at shopping from the yarn pantry, but I have bought yarn this year which I definitely didn't need. I actually have about 5 unopened packages of yarn in the office, bought for specific projects, but which I absolutely did not need. It's a struggle. Yes, Noelle, yes it is. But we just keep practicing. The only way you get better at anything is practice, practice, practice. And then episode 10, how to stop buying yarn that's only going to end up getting purged later. This was the episode I hesitated the most before filming because I didn't want it to feel preachy or joyless or like I was telling anyone how to spend their money. This video is meant for you if you feel uncomfortable about how much of your income seems to magically morph into fiber on the shelf or in a box that you only interact with once every year or 5 or 10. If you just twitched when I said that, this video is for you. And judging by the comments, a lot of you felt the same way I do about this. Yarn buying isn't just about having yarn. Sometimes it's about comfort. Sometimes it's about stress. Sometimes it's about feeling inspired when you're tired. Thanks, Oscar. That's very generous of you. Putting adding numbers to it, even rough ones, wasn't about guilt. It was about awareness. Once I could see how much yarn was coming in versus how much was actually being knit, I could make decisions instead of promises. And the biggest shift, stopping the idea that buying yarn was the reward and realizing that using it actually felt better.
Behind your yarn buying. Sometimes it's inspiration, but often it's emotion. People find solace in shopping for all kinds of reasons. Personally, I'm prone to anxiety. And when I've hit a day where the angst is breaking through my regular anxiety management protocols, I can find myself paging through my favorite online shops and adding hand-dyed merino to the cart because it feels like happiness and possibility. And that's okay. Yarn is joy, and a little bit of retail therapy is totally fine, but it's really, really easy to let it get out of hand. Ask me how I know.
Consider this from Lavender Cottage Fiber Arts. In general, I try the delay tactic with a lot of discretionary spending, especially during sales periods like Black Friday. I tell myself you don't have to resist forever, just until the sale has finished. And then once the sale has ended, I think, well, it would be silly to buy it now at full price when it was just on sale. I'll just wait for the next sale. A knitting/crochet specific trick that sometimes helps me when I really want to buy some nice yarn is to allow myself to cast on a new project regardless of how many current whips I have. It often scratches the newness itch for me, especially if I pick some nice yarn that has been sitting in my stash almost forgotten for ages, and especially if that yarn kind of dupes the vibes of whatever I was wanting to purchase. It does mean I probably have a slightly problematic number of whips most of the time, but I figure they will eventually get completed, and it's better than buying yarn I don't need. This comment really summed up what I was trying to get across in this episode. Such a common experience. Thank you so much for adding that to that comment section. And finally, there's part 11. This is the episode that really had a huge impact on my stash management goals. By the time we got to planning, I think we were all a little wiser and possibly a little tired. Because if you've ever made a beautiful knitting plan and then ignored it completely, you already know the truth. The problem isn't discipline. The problem is fantasy. Yes, Oscar, Fantasy Nicole does knit faster.
The Stash 2025. Yeah, I know it's 2026. Stuff happened and I'm just a little bit behind. Thank you for your patience. If you're like me, you have made some really solid knitting plans. Patterns picked, yarn ready, projects neatly bagged up, and then somehow knit absolutely none of it. This doesn't happen because you and I are bad at planning, and we're definitely not bad at knitting. The problem is that most knitting plans are built on assumptions that don't really probably match how our knitting actually works. They assume consistent motivation. I'm going to knit every day. Predictable energy. Ha! Perfect seasonal timing, as if, and a version of you who never impulse casts on. Yeah, Oscar gets it. F is pretty important, and this is the excitement factor.
You don't want to skip this one. These points matter. Do I want this item or project now? If a project scores well everywhere else, but gets 0 here, that's important information. If you're not excited about it, chances are it's going to rise to the top of your list pretty slim. What finally worked for me was planning around how I actually knit, not how I wish I knit. Some projects are comfort knitting. Some require focus. Some only happen when my brain is calm and my life isn't on fire. Once I stopped pretending every project deserved equal priority, planning stopped feeling like pressure and started feeling like permission. Permission to choose, to reshuffle, to say, not this year. Here's how this episode helped Susan, who is one of my After Hours Lounge channel members, and she lives in Norway. She says, "Sure do love how your brain works and that you share it. I see now that the lack of any overview has acted as an obstacle and a stress. I'll do your spreadsheet gratefully. And I think now I might add my studying to the types column. That is, doing the technique online classes I've already downloaded, but haven't yet allowed myself the time to attend." And I'll just break here for a sec because I know exactly what Susan's talking about. I still have dozens of my Knit Stars classes that I need to watch. I get it. Back to the comment. I may also add a column for gauge, so I factor in how many small needle size projects I'll be asking of my vulnerable hands. All in all, thank you once again, dear Nicole. You are most welcome, my friend, and I love the idea of incorporating new technique class time into the mix. Brilliant. And now let's talk about the thing that actually changed everything for me. Here's something I didn't fully understand until after I filmed the last episode. Out of everything we talked about this year, sorting, selling, cataloging, stash shopping, budgeting, the single thing that changed my knitting life the most was that spreadsheet. I thought it was just going to be a planning tool, something logical and very on brand for me. What I didn't expect was how clarifying it would be. Because once I actually laid everything out, the projects, the yarn I already owned, how long things really take me to knit, there was nowhere left to hide or pretend. I could see very plainly that I do not knit 6 sweaters a year. I do not knit 12 shawls. And I absolutely do not need to plan for a version of myself who suddenly knits all day, every day without interruption. And instead of feeling discouraging, it was freeing. Once I stopped planning for an imaginary future knitter, I could finally plan for me. And that's when things started moving. Projects that had been sitting just in case suddenly became an obvious, no, I'm never going to knit that, and are now in my purge bag. My 2025 purge sucker's heavy. Yarn that I've been hanging on to out of guilt finally lost its grip on my Yarn Dragon scales. And the projects that did stay, they stayed for real reasons. The spreadsheet didn't just help me plan, it helped me decide. And that's why I've purged even more yarn after finishing this series on top of everything I purged in episode 2. That's why my current projects actually match my real lifetime and energy, and why my stash finally feels like a resource instead of a responsibility. And most importantly, I need to give a huge shout out to Cleanna, who also lives here on Vancouver Island, for being an absolutely amazing spreadsheet master and sending me more than a few drafts with incredible improvements to my original, including running totals for categories and super cool conditional formatting that automatically changes the color of the row when you reassign that project to a different quarter. Cleanna and I are going to keep tweaking it until we're satisfied, and then discuss how we go about sharing it with you if you're interested. I know there are people for whom spreadsheets are a hard no. If all of this, the list, the buckets, the priorities, feels like too much and no fun, you are officially allowed to ignore every single word I just said. If what brings you joy is knitting with wild abandon, casting on whatever you want, whenever you want, with absolutely no plan, that is not a failure. That is a perfectly valid way to enjoy this hobby. So, if you watch this whole series, or even just parts of it, and you're thinking, okay, but what actually matters? Here's my honest answer. You don't need to organize harder. You don't need stricter rules. You don't need better storage. What you need is a clear picture of how you really knit, and permission to plan from that reality. Yeah, this time Oscar's right. For me, that picture came from a spreadsheet. For you, it might come from something else. But once you see it clearly, everything else gets easier. Jessica from Just Making It emailed me with her extraordinary stash journey, and I wanted to share it with you. Hi, Nicole. I want to thank you for your stash tracking videos. So, I have a Yarn Dragon hoard's worth of yarn stash, no exaggeration. My mom owns a yarn shop and gifts me stash regularly. I have my own business that is fiber fabric related, so I am used to buying in bulk at wholesale and bulk when there's a sale. I'm going to give myself a thumbs up because my yarn spending is down 70% from last year. Well done, Jessica. I'm also doing a pretty decent job tracking not only yarn in, out, and cost, but also what I bought and for whatever purpose. I have a long way to go to get down to where I'd like to be at, but I'm doing okay. And part of that is thanks to you and the encouragement to just be more intentional, set some rules, and don't be in a hurry to click buy now. I will continue working on it, reducing stash as I can, and using all your stash busting and organizing strategies. I do have a couple of tips for other Yarn Dragon hoarders out there. 1, when you feel the urge to buy, go into your stash and dig through it. Not just what's on the surface, but pull the oldies out and rearrange and refill project ideas with the yarn you already have. Nothing stops me from buying like pulling out yarn and seeing the actual quantity that I have. Tip 2. When I go through the stash, I put yarn kits together and then put them into some of the totes that are right out front. Then when I want to start something new, but feel like it might turn into a shopping spree, I go to the yarn kits and start knitting something I've kitted up instead of going online for shopping. Thank you so much for your honesty and great tips, Jessica. You certainly inspired me, and I have no doubt that you inspired others as well. If you've been following along this year, I'd love to hear how it actually went for you. What changed? What didn't? What successes did you have? Where do you still need to work a little bit more? And what surprised you most once you stopped pretending you were a different kind of knitter? I say goodbye. Oscar says goodbye. I've linked the full Untangle the Stash 2025 playlist over here. You can jump back to the episodes that apply to you. Not all of them, just the ones you need right now. No rules, no guilt, just knitting that fits your real life. Knit your joy.